Welcome to the Playground Talks podcast, a podcast for busy parents who want to own their parenting style and develop a stronger sense of how to handle challenging situations. I am Tamia Friat, your host and a mother of three. In this podcast, I will interview psychologists, practitioners, behavioral therapists, teachers, and other experts about topics that bother all of us as parents, so you can get both the parenting principles and practical aspects that resonate with you, give you confidence and joy. Hey there, and welcome to Season 2 of the Playground Talks podcast. This season will start by focusing on resilience, and for the opening episode, our guest is Dr. Jordana Mortimer. Dr. Mortimer is a licensed psychologist currently practicing in Fort Worth, Texas. She has an experience working with school district and the hospital setting. Dr. Mortimer has been married for 15 years and has two children ages 7 and 9. In this episode, we covered what is resilient, what are the skills related to being resilient, and how can you support your child developing resilient. Dr. Mortimer shared a research-based strategies to make your home a place where you find true enjoyment. So let's dive into that. Good morning, Jordana. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming. I do know that I personally, when I think about resilience, I imagine it like a person who's really strong, that everything that goes in his life, it doesn't touch him. It's like life is so smooth. And honestly, that's an unrealistic expectation, especially from our kids that should develop all those skills. So I want to start and ask you, what does resilience mean?
Sure. Great question. So resilience is kind of that ability to bounce back quickly from something that was difficult or an adversity, and having those skill sets to adapt no matter what the situation is. So if it was something easy, you can move on quickly, but even if it's really hard, you have your own set of strategies in order to continue to move on without it negatively impacting you. So it's kind of like a protective barrier. And you're right, there are some people who seem to be more naturally resilient than others and things don't impact them. And that's kind of our ideal of what we think that would look like. Previously, it really was viewed as almost primarily a psychological component that you had. And some people had it and some people did not have it. But we've learned through research that you can grow this skill. This is something that can be learned. There is a biological component where some people appear to be a bit more resilient. But like with most things, there's a nature and a nurture component. So it is something that parents can impart on their children, can teach them how to be more resilient, which is good news. You're not out of luck if your child isn't just naturally very resilient.
Yeah, it gives me a much more optimistic view of my children and myself. So let's dig in. What are the skills related to being resilient?
Sure, there's a lot of things. The other thing I probably should have clarified is that resilience doesn't mean, it is a protective factor, and that you have a set of skills or coping strategies, but it certainly doesn't keep you from ever experiencing significant adversity, right? So we're still going to have stress. And so this is just giving us the ability to continue our lives without being significantly negatively impacted. So the skills related to resilience would be, one, having your own set of coping strategies. And this, I think, is one of the great things that parents can teach their children. There's a lot of research now, and a lot of people are trying to emphasize teaching kids, how can you, when you're feeling really overwhelmed, be aware of those feelings, be aware of how your thoughts are impacting your behavior and the way your body feels inside those somatic components, and then being able to figure out what works for you in order to kind of come to that state of calm or homeostasis. So that's important. Some other skills would be problem solving. So being able to see that we have an area of difficulty or a problem that we're facing and kind of breaking that down, or figuring out how can we get to the goal that we need, or how can we process through that, whether that's activity we have to do, whether that's in a relationship and we're having conflict with a friend, but being able to figure out like, okay, this is what the problem is. Here are the steps I can take in order to kind of process through that. That is helpful. Patience is a component, but that one is a little bit hard. And that is hard for us as adults too. I think even though our brains are fully formed, we still have a hard time with patience. And I think that brings up a good component is that we often want our kids to be really great at things, or we get surprised when they get really frustrated. But we as adults, where our brains are fully formed already, still struggle significantly sometimes when things are really difficult and we have to push ourselves beyond what we're usually comfortable with in order to reach a goal. So if we can kind of reflect on our own frustration sometimes, I think we can extend a bit more grace to our children when they have a difficult time. And that usually manifests, in negative behaviors that we don't want, whether that's crying or getting really frustrated or whining or quitting. And we tend to put even more pressure on them. Like, why is this bothering you? Why can't you just do this? We know that you can do it. Just do it. And that usually doesn't get us the outcome that we want. Some other skills that are related would be commitment. So kids learning that once they agree to do something, they have to follow it through. And that's a hard one. And I know that's kind of leading into something else, but I'll just say it's important for us as parents to help our children keep their commitment. So for example, if they want to try out a new sport or an extracurricular activity, and, they like, oh, I promise that if you sign me up for soccer, my friends are doing it. I'm going to love doing it. I promise. And then you go to the first practice and they have to run the whole time and they're sweating. They're like, you know what? Actually, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. No, thanks. But having a conversation from the beginning of, hey, you said you wanted to do this. We made a commitment. We signed up and we're part of a team. Other people are counting on you. You may not like it so much, but there's still a skill that we can probably learn from this experience. So let's let this play out. And you gave your word, and then we'll talk about it when, the season's over, or however many lessons if you signed up for guitar or piano. And that teaches them that we don't quit when things get hard. We still have to keep pushing through.
Yeah, that's so true. I had just the same thing with my daughter. She would apply to something and then she didn't want to go. So we made an agreement and I asked her, what's the time frame that we can agree on that you're going to try? And by then we'll reassess if you want to continue or not. So in this example, how much would you say would be the minimum that a parent should coach his child to try, to give it a try?
Sure. So I think that's a good conversation to have at the beginning. So this actually happened with my daughter in basketball. Some other girls from school were signing up. She was excited. We thought it was an all-girls team. And we talked about before, okay, this is how many games there are. The season lasts for so many weeks. And normally, like in elementary school, it's like 8 or 10 weeks, right? It's usually not a significant period of time for a season. So we showed up and it turns out it was co-ed. And this was already in 3rd grade. So 3rd grade boys, most of them had already played basketball and we had not. And I did not play sports growing up. So I had no advice to give her on how to play basketball. So she was like, Mom, this was not what I thought it was going to be. And I was like, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be either. But we signed up. We made a commitment to our team. We're just going to try. And we learned some great skills and strategies, how we have to show up. Even if we don't like things, we can find moments where it can be enjoyable. It's still nice to be, part of a team and have that camaraderie. At the end of the season, we got an email that was like, congratulations, you finished your first season of soccer. And her immediate response was first and last season. So it's like, okay, I got it. And it doesn't mean that we didn't have that conversation multiple times, like, hey, I know that we have another basketball game this weekend. I know it's not what you're really looking forward to. We made a commitment. And we kind of have a catchphrase in our family to teach this skill specifically. And a family phrase is Mortimers don't give up. And so we just kind of reflect on that, like, hey, Mortimers don't give up. This is an opportunity for us to show that in real life. And we can talk about it at the end, what we've learned. Even if, again, it's not our favorite thing and we don't ever want to do it again, there's some little nugget amongst all the difficulty that can be positive.
I get that. One season, it's a good starting point.
Yeah, one season. And, I guess if you're signing, it's always a good idea too. Most places will give you like a few trial lessons. It's like commercial arts is pretty good at giving you a lesson or two or a week. If it's instrument and you would have to buy the instrument, I definitely would try a few before you fully commit, because that ends up being a lot more of a financial component in addition to a time component. Of course, giving them options to test something out. We don't want to be stressed out ourselves as parents and forcing them. Right. So there's some pre-work we can do to make sure that they have enough of an idea of what they're actually asking for. So like, hey, if you want to sign up for piano, that's great, but you're going to have to practice every day. And then you have a lesson once a week. Or if you want to do soccer, like, hey, that's great, but every day you probably need to practice kicking the ball. So it's explaining what those parameters really look like, what's really going to be asked and required of them. Like you're going to have to be outside and running and it's going to be hot and sweaty. Are you prepared for that? So we can do some pre-teaching beforehand and not just sign them up haphazardly and then tell them, well, too bad, so sad, I signed you up. You have to do it. So obviously, there needs to be some collaboration at the beginning for that decision.
Totally get that. I actually digged into the commitment component, but you started by saying that we, in order to be resilient, need to develop skills such as commitment and self-awareness and coping skills. Is there anything else you want to add?
For the skills related to resilience. Yeah. So I think, and the other one I would say is being able to ask for help. So I think a lot of times we assume that resilience means that you are just a strong individual. And a key factor, and we're going to talk about this, I know, in a minute, for good resilience, that we talked about that biological component and then that nature versus nurture. So the nurture component is the biggest research-based factor outside of genetics for resiliency, is a loving, committed relationship with an adult, whether that be a parent or a grandparent or some caregiver. And that's the big thing we're going to talk about with how can we support that skill is, one, if we're just committed, if they're listening to this podcast and they're wanting to learn more about being a better parent, they're already, on the right track and invest in that process. That is a big protective factor. And in that relationship, being able to ask for help or acknowledging mistakes is super helpful, because you don't have to do it alone. We are social creatures. We are meant to be in community with one another. And it's a sign of strength to know your own boundaries and limitations and when you need to ask other people for some support.
I resonate with this a lot, and I'm sensing two things. It's asking for help is modeling as a parent that I'm asking for support and advice, and also encouraging my child to ask for help whenever he needed that. And also you mentioned advocating for yourself, which is another piece for the child to be able to say, that's what I need, or that's what I want, or I didn't feel comfortable when, my sibling hit me.
Right.
Which goes to the part that you mentioned, to solving problem, like encourage the kids to solve the problem by himself. And then if he can't do it, then ask for help.
Yeah. And I want to clarify too, because I think depending on their age and developmental level, a lot of times, yes, we want them to problem solve independently, but that's the end goal. So there's a lot of steps in between of them not having, and this goes for all the skill sets we're talking about, right? We're starting at a zero, when we're born outside of natural resiliency, but patience is hard. Problem solving is hard. Asking for help is hard. It's hard for me as an adult to ask for help still, even though I know that it's good and important and other people want the opportunity to help most of the time. So we need to break those down and not have adult expectations for what some of these things look like. We need to have child expectations. So specifically for problem solving, my typical advice is having them reflect on what the problem is and how that impacts themselves and other people. Usually it does in some way, whether that's emotional or behavioral, because they're upset with someone or a conflict happened. And then give them a few options on if they can't generate it themselves, because especially at the early age, they're probably not going to be able to come up with the best way to handle it. And so give them a few options and hey, based on what you're telling me, these look like different ways that we could handle the problem. Which one do you think would be a good choice? And let them make the choice, even if that would not have been your number one way of solving it, so that they can see what the feedback is. And so after they try that problem solving approach, maybe it does work and we move on and they've learned how to use that strategy. Or if it doesn't work, say okay, man, bummer. Looks like we have to try another one. So it's definitely a collaborative problem-solving process. Again, they're still making decisions. They're still doing all the actions, but then cognitively thinking through what are all the different things involved in solving it probably needs some adult support.
Mm-hmm. So how can a parent actually can support his child developing resilience according to the age? Because probably I wouldn't expect to have a whole discussion like that with a 2-year-old. So if you could dig into that.
Sure. Yeah. So like we said, first is having just a really loving relationship. So at 2, we're doing a lot of exploring environment, a lot of cause and effect. And so a lot of that can be frustrating, like, a toddler eating and throwing food on the ground to see what happens. And so them ability to do that without us always being angry or taking it personally and be like, oh, well, when you throw food on the floor, it goes on the floor and that's not good. And it shows me that you are finished eating. Is that what you're saying? And they can either say yes, I'm done, and you take it away, or they can say no. And okay, well then don't throw food on the ground and I won't take that away. So it's a little way to kind of build in them understanding problem solving and our actions have an effect. Most of that's going to be through modeling a specific situation. You're right. We cannot have deep conversations with a 2-year-old about those things, but then modeling a lot of, regardless of the ages, modeling those skills and being able to say oh, when this happens, I see you're frustrating, and reflecting back on those emotions and saying, It's okay to get frustrated when your toy doesn't work. Do you want to fix it, or do you want, mommy or daddy to help you fix it? So it's an opportunity in just those little small moments. We're modeling for them how we can still stay calm. We're validating that emotion and that it's okay. We can't fix that emotion for them, and we shouldn't. They need to learn to sit with that and overcome it. But we can still guide them on the process of getting to the end result. And then they have a choice. You want to try again? Are you able to do that without being too frustrated, or do you need some outside support? I think that's a big way to help kind of get them on that process, is when they're experiencing frustration, to just reflect and say, hey, man, that looks really frustrating and it's hard. Would you like to try again, or do you want to ask for help? And that, I think, that's a little bit older. It's kind of getting more towards 4 and 5 and up, but you can still get those simple choices when they're a younger toddler.
Yeah, totally works, especially with the ones that are like really bossy, or today they call them leaders. They want to do everything by themselves. So when they turn too terrible too, it's not going to work. Otherwise, I know from it firsthand.
Yes. My daughter is one of those leaders. It's good. That's good. They want to make decisions. They want to make things happen. And those are good goals as an adult. We just get frustrated as parents because we are like, that's great later, but right now I just kind of want you to do what I say.
Yeah, I always think about it that in the short term, it makes my life as a parent a bit harder. But in the long term, I know this boy will survive.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect description of what's happening. Is it's normally a reflection of our own frustration, right? It's not so much a problem with the child having that personality characteristic. It's our ability as a parent to maybe guide them because of that personality characteristic the best way.
Yeah, I think it's many times falling into timing boundaries, that we have to get things done in a certain time and the kids just want to do it by themselves. So it takes like 10 times more than it should. So we are being impatient, as you said. It's a lot about patience.
Yeah, I just think about normal morning routine, I think that's a time when most of us as parents get really impatient because we're trying to get out the door and go to work, or we have somewhere to be, or the kids have to go to school. And a lot of it comes down to did we plan accordingly enough for the time that it probably takes? I notice on mornings where things seem to go swimmingly, it's like, oh, I got up a little bit earlier and got myself ready so that I could guide them along, versus me feeling rushed and then pushing that, feeling upon my own kids sometimes.
Yeah, it circled up to the beginning of our discussion talking about resilience, self-awareness. And
yes.
So we started with the 2 years old, and can we move on, and how do we support the child as he grow up? And also, what's the expectation? Like you talked also about how much time does it take to a person to recover from this bump?
Like, is there an expectation of how long it should take you to recover?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. I don't think that we can put a time limit. And if your child takes a little bit of extra time, that is like a warning bell, like, oh, let's red flag that. I don't think it quite works that way. If I could sum it, would be being able to handle that difficulty in a positive or proactive way. So they can still be frustrated, but if they have a coping strategy to be calm and realize okay, and kids are still allowed to be upset and mad, right? We as adults are still upset and mad at times when things happen, but it's ability to say okay, that was really upsetting, but I know that I need to do it anyway. And so I'm either going to go take a break. I am going to take a walk. I'm going to talk to a friend about it. I'm going to get some feedback on what would be the best way to approach this. So we're still sitting in maybe the negative emotion for a minute, but we're still proactively trying to overcome it. So I think you can have both of those things at the same time. Resilience doesn't mean you have to be cheerful all the time, right? About when you have something that's really difficult, that doesn't mean you are like a Pollyanna where you're just like, oh, that was really hard. That's okay. My day is great. I'm still doing it. That would be an unrealistic expectation because we're humans and life can be really hard a lot of the times. And it's okay for both of those things to exist at the same time.
So you just mentioned some great coping skills, which is walk away, talk to a friend, take a break, just do something different. And those are the things which we can start and implement and guide our kiddos. So when do you think you could actually guide your kids to do those kind of coping skills?
So yes, that definitely progresses. I think when toddlers, as parents, we're probably pretty good at the distraction technique, where we kind of direct them to something else, but we don't necessarily need to always distract them from emotions all the time. They're allowed to experience some negative things, but we can move them forward. We don't need them to have a long tantrum.
When would you start to guide your child to use the more advanced, I would say, coping skills?
Sure. So I think small pieces of moving it along developmentally is important. If we're modeling from a young age, so let's take, for example, that they are 3 and 4. Something that you can do is some awareness or grounding techniques. So things like, 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can smell, some things that you can touch, and doing those outside, or things like laying outside on a blanket and staring up at the clouds and looking at what shapes the clouds are making and feeling the wind be on you and just being able to be present with your own body and your own thoughts. And those are okay. And those can be, again, they're probably going to be really brief for a 4 and 5-year-old. You may not even get through all the different numbers of things that you can do, but that's a great way to kind of give them some exposure. And then, of course, them seeing you do it. I think that's a big component because a lot of times let's take breathing, for example. Breathing strategies actually have a lot of research behind them because they can regulate your blood pressure. They really do help you calm down. But a lot of times we don't practice or model for our children. And so what happens is in the heat of the moment, we say like, okay, look, let's do those breathing strategies. But it sounds almost like a consequence or punishment, like, oh, you got upset, so now you have to go do these, because we don't ever do them at any other time. They don't know how to do them well. And especially in a moment where you are having heightened emotions, your breathing and heart rate and everything are occurring at a faster rate. And so you might start breathing, but they're going to be breathing really rapidly, which is the opposite of what we want them to do. So the component is having a regular enough practice where we're doing it so that it is a natural, normal thing where it's like, oh, I see you're starting to get really upset and frustrated. You know how we always or regularly do that thing where we breathe in for a couple counts and we breathe out for a couple counts. Let's try that and see if that can help us, before we get to the period of problem solving. That's another good point is we need to be able to be calm and collected when we're making some of those decisions. And there's okay to have a period of time in between when an event happens and letting our children experience that emotion and overcome it and then move to the problem solving approach. A lot of times I think we accidentally escalate a situation because right then we want them to solve it. We want it to be over with. We don't have time to deal with it. We just need to move on. But we're not allowing that little gap in between them learning that self-regulation and that resilience of like, this feeling was really icky and frustrating. I don't like it, but I can survive it and overcome it. And then we move to that problem solving approach.
Yeah.
So just that regular practice. And then as they grow, they'll have more insight into like, oh, I can pick up on these things on my own and be able to verbalize them. Whereas at the beginning, you're going to have to guide and model that a pretty significant amount. So that should be your expectation that you're definitely taking the lead role. And it takes practice. So you're definitely going to stumble and maybe not include all the components. And that's okay as long as we're together and focus on being calm and your child sees that you're connected and really focused on letting them handle that feeling. That's the important component to focus on, not whether or not you do all the steps correctly, whether you do them in the wrong order, just being present and being able to manage your own emotions, right? And you can self-regulate. That is the great best step.
I get that the first thing a parent should be aware of is not to own his child discomfort and move towards the solving problem mode immediately, but just to hold the space for the child to come down with the strategies you just mentioned and then move to the more talking piece.
Yeah, it seems like this. I think sometimes we view it as kind of like, I don't want to say a waste of time, but just maybe we don't have time to include that component. But I think when we don't include that, when we then try to get to the problem solving component, we've either escalated the situation or they can't really make a decision. And so then we just kind of drag it out even longer than it probably would have been in the first place. So it's just a little investment that usually then is rewarded in them being able to move on and cope with it and have a positive attitude and realize like, oh, I was able to handle that, which is the skill we're looking for.
Yeah, you say that the foundation for the solving problem mode is, first of all, validate whatever they feel and let them move out of it. So parents trying to escalate the process is just doing the opposite.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? That's what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we think if we tell them like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, or it's really not that bad, or you shouldn't be that upset about it, we're teaching the wrong message, that their feelings aren't true. And sometimes feelings are irrational. And that's definitely in later age where we kind of talk about that, later elementary, mid to late elementary. And we can ask good questions like, like, what made you think that? Or, why do you think they had that response to you? But their feelings are their feelings. Just like as adults, if someone tells us, oh, you shouldn't have been that upset that that person said that to you, or, oh, your boss really didn't mean it that way, that normally just makes us really defensive. But same thing, it makes our children really defensive. And that certainly isn't helping the relationship for them to be able to come with us with their problems. That's what our goal is, for them to come to us. But if we're dismissive or tell them that it's not as bad as they think it is, in just kind of an irritated, frustrated way, that, like you said, it's making the problem worse.
Totally get that. So that leads me to the next question, which is, in which scenarios you could indicate that my kid is not resilient according to his age development stage, and the parent or the kid might need an external support?
Sure. So at age 2 and 3, they are not resilient. So, I think we all have a funny story about them asking you specifically for a request, like, please cut my sandwich in half. And then you do. And, that is, a level 5 sent over the edge, right? Not rectangles, but triangles. And we got it wrong. So again, just having a good expectation that they cannot handle it on their own. And that is okay. And really, we're looking at end of 3, beginning of 4, where they're going to start to be able to be a little bit better at handling, like if a peer grabs a toy from their hand and they don't immediately react and lash out against them. So, later years, 4 and 5, we're going to start to see those skills. And that's really where we can step in to that situation and say, oh, I bet it made you really upset that Johnny took that toy from you. What can we do about this? And so we can say, hey, do you think they can find something else to play with? Or do you want to go ask Johnny for the toy back? And then also there's a whole nother situation with handling the other child who took the toy and giving them some choices about how they could ask, for the toy, or when will they be done so that they can have a turn. So those are great ways to start modeling some of those decisions when they can, one, have the verbal skills. If they don't have the verbal skills to process what you're saying or to express their feelings, that's obviously going to make it more difficult. So we see in kids who have a major speech impairment, we do see an increase in behaviors because it's frustrating when you have a lot of things that you're feeling and thinking, and the people around you aren't able to understand that. And so that's a big component too to keep in mind, is having the language ability to process what adults are saying, and then also for them to individually be able to express themselves.
So I'm sensing that if a parent have a slightly concern with his kid's speech development, then he should seek some help
for speech. Yes,
because this could be a great predictor for behavior down the roads, right? That's what I'm understanding.
So then as they get older, what we would start to see would be things like getting what we like very emotionally overwhelmed when something doesn't work. So for example, like for a kid who can't put the pieces of a toy together and they, are breaking down and crying would be one. As we get older, we might see, I can give a personal example of like my daughter trying to learn a new hard piano song, and just like laying her head down on the keys and being like, I can't do it. There's no way. It's too hard. I'll never be able to play it. And so we say like, okay, well, it's really hard. How about you just take the first line, like only focus on the first 10 notes. Let's just see if we can do that. And then all of a sudden, we get to the end and she's playing the whole song at her recital. So it's a good example. If we just saw that frustration in our children and thought like, oh, this is too much for them, rather than guiding them on like, how do we break it down? How do we, validate it is really frustrating. It's hard when we have to do something that doesn't feel natural or doesn't come easily. But then if we help them with that patience, we help them with that commitment, we help them with the problem solving because we broke it down into a smaller chunk, they're getting those little periods of success. And so it's releasing all those feel-good neurotransmitters. That's like, wow, that felt great that I did that and I did learn it. It's a similar process, I feel like, with most kids in reading. Reading is hard if it doesn't come naturally. But if you stick to it and then you can reflect like, hey, you weren't able to read this word and now you are, then they release that feel-good neurotransmitter, and that's what's motivating them to then be able to push themselves the next time because they realize like, oh, that was hard. I felt this before. I don't like it, but I can survive it. And then we're creating a snowball of success, which is then setting them up for much harder things when they are teens into young adulthood, into full adulthood, where we still have things that require us to commit or to complete actions that are difficult. It's all those little snowballs building in order to have those lifelong resilient skills.
So to break it down into little wins, that's the key.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, for us too, like if we just think about how overwhelming, let's say, we have to clean the house, and it's like, where do I even start? It's like, okay, well, I'm just going to start with the dishes and I'm going to clean off the counters. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that felt good. It's obviously for myself, like that's less anxiety provoking. It seems like there's a sense of calm and peace. Like, okay, I did this. Let's break it down. My daughter is about to turn 10, and so taking a lot more responsibility. Slowly, we also do not so much, yes, chores, but just what does it require for you to be a part of our household? Like we all have to contribute in some way in order for our house to run. And sometimes she feels that way about her own room. Like, oh my gosh, there's clothes everywhere and the puzzle exploded and there's pens and markers from coloring everywhere. And so it's breaking it down like, okay, just do your clothes. Don't worry about anything else. Just do that and see if you can do it. It's like, oh, I finished that in 10 minutes. See, yeah, it's not that hard. And so the same for us. We're still working on some of the same things as our kids, is breaking it down and learning how to have that small win in a big task.
Yeah, it happens with cleanup as well. If the Lego is out and the magnet tiles is out and many cars is out, the kids, they don't have a clue where to start. So we also just focus on the magnets and then move on. So I like this idea. It really works good. Anything else you would like to add in regard to scenarios that indicate that kids might need an extra? Because I'm hearing that in about, let's say, 4, they should be able to manage more of this frustrating moment.
Yeah. So they're still going to have an emotional reaction, right? But yeah, we can definitely start guiding them on asking them how they want to start moving forward with solving it. They can definitely be an active participant rather than us just telling them what they need to do to solve it. And building that coping strategy set, again, just having really small expectations of what they can be doing. So what we would notice is an emotional reaction, not being able to persist. So getting frustrated and wanting to quit and not being able to move on. And just, kind of that frustration, easily discouraged is what we want to push through. And I think related to resilience, there's been a greater awareness and education related to growth mindset. That has become a big thing, kind of a buzzword, which is definitely related to it's okay to make mistakes. This is a learning process. How do we still get focused on getting to the end and, not being able to do something yet? So that power of the word yet is closely tied. And I think us focusing that through the school system, a lot of school systems are incorporating that into their educational process, and parents incorporating that and allowing mistakes. That's going to be a normal process of being a human, is definitely helping them realize like it's okay that I didn't do it right the first time. Because a lot of times that's where it stems from. It's like I should have already been able to do it. Like either put that toy together exactly how I wanted or made that picture or drawing exactly how I wanted it to be in my mind, and that didn't work. More related to just daily tasks sometimes than big things like sports or music. They just didn't meet their own expectations, and that is frustrating to them. Like, okay, you're right. You didn't do it. Do you want help? Do you want to watch a video about how to draw that better? Do you want to just try again? We can support them so they can kind of overcome that and learn to do it independently, and how it is a process. We don't do it usually right the very first time, and that's okay. None of us normally do.
Mm-hmm. So just to embrace the process itself before it even gets to the expectation of the result in our mind.
Yeah, a regular practice of this probably is going to take a few times and it might be frustrating along the way. And if that's what the kids are expecting of a process, rather than they're always going to do it right away the first time, exactly how it should be, we're lowering their own expectations, not in a negative way. We want them to reach great goals and we want to push them to do great things. But it's a learning process with emotional skills, with actual academic skills, behavioral skills. We just start small and slowly build across all of those different areas of development.
Well, that made it really clear how we should be kind of the coach for our children. That's what it is.
Yeah.
I like that. Anything else you would like to add?
I guess one way for parents to know like how to push them or how to know, what would be an appropriate expectation is there's this idea of a zone of proximal development. And what that means is we want to look at what skill set are they currently able to do where they feel successful and not very frustrated, and then nudge that just a little bit. So we're not making really high expectations, just barely out of their comfort zone. And so those are the slow steps. The best way to kind of think about like, well, how do I set a goal for my child that's attainable is look at what their current skill set is and nudge it up just a little bit. So Let's say that let's do the piano example. They can only sit really for about 5 minutes before they get frustrated. Let's say, okay, well, let's try it for 6 minutes. And so we're going to slowly build that. So it's about taking their current skill set and just bumping it up a little bit would be a good indicator for how parents would know how to move forward.
So kind of help them create their own scale, their own bar.
Exactly. Right. And it's going to look different for every single individual. Each one of your children across they might be struggling more in one area, but doing excellent in another. So they probably don't need to push themselves in the area where they're already excelling. We need to focus on the one where they need support there. And then obviously that'll look a lot different from your other child. And so just evaluating their own skill set and how to bump that just a little bit.
Got it. Well, it was so good. We got so much. And I like the whole new perspective about resilience, which make it so much more realistic.
Yes.
So thank you, Jordana, so much for being with me today and sharing from your experience and knowledge. And have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks for asking really good questions. And hopefully this is helpful for pushing our children to meet some goals.
Well, I hope so too. And we'll have your great online course will be attached. So if someone wants to get more of your content, he'll be able to do so.
Yes, it definitely focuses on helping build that relationship, giving some coping strategies to your kids. And a definite emphasis is problem solving. How do we teach our children problem solving so that they can fix their own mistakes, which is an important life goal. So thanks for mentioning it.
Of course. Bye. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you so much for joining and listening to the conversation with Dr. Jordana Mortimer. Dr. Jordana started with explaining that resilient is the ability to bounce back from something that was difficult or an adversity and having those skill set to adapt no matter what the situation is. We talked about the skill related to being resilient, which are coping skills, problem solving, being patient, being committed, and ask for help. The coping technique we mentioned was for the younger kids, 2 years old, are distraction technique. And for the older kids, 3 and 4, are being aware to body sensation, grounding technique, modeling, practice when regulated, and problem-solving approach. So those were some of the takeaway from Jordana, and if you want to get more of her content and her great online course, please look at the show note. All the links are there. In the next episode, we'll have Dr. Kate Lund. She is a psychologist, also known as an expert for resilient and the author of the book Bounce. You can help me spread those parenting tools by subscribing to the Playground Talks, share it with family and friends, and rank it. And finally, treat yourself and your kids with compassion and curiosity. Bye-bye. See you in 2 weeks.